Hey all, I hope you are doing well. In this video, we're going to explore some concepts from the book Mastering Bitcoin. We're going to take a look at Bitcoin keys, addresses, wallets, asymmetric cryptography, deterministic key generation, lots of interesting stuff. All the fundamentals you need to really understand how Bitcoin works under the hood. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Let's talk about keys and addresses. So, in everyday life, when you want to send somebody money, you need a destination, and that's usually a bank account number. Bitcoin works the same way. If you need to send somebody some Bitcoin, you'd need a number, an address to, to do that. And these addresses are just random looking numbers. And unlike bank accounts where you need to go to a bank, show your ID, there's a lot of paperwork involved. In Bitcoin, you do not need to ask anybody for permission. You just generate that random number, provide it to the sender, and they'll be able to send you some Bitcoin immediately. So, what is a Bitcoin address? A Bitcoin address is simply a public key. And with its corresponding private key, they form a key pair. The private key is used to spend the money and the public key to receive it. So if Alice wants to send money to Bob, she creates a transaction that she signs with her private key, and she indicates Bob's public key in the output, and the transaction is propagated to the network, and after a few minutes, Bob will be able to spend the money. So this is the cool thing about Bitcoin. It enables this peer-to-peer payment. There are no central entities involved. You just need your funds that you unlock with your private key, and you need the public key of the recipient to change the records of ownership of these funds. So we've been talking about public keys, private keys. What the heck are they? So public keys and private keys are part of what we call asymmetric cryptography. Asymmetric because they are not alike. They are asymmetric. Cool. This is unlike symmetric cryptography where you encrypt the data using the same key. So what's the general idea of asymmetric cryptography? It works like this. If you have a public key and a private key, by the way, as their name indicates, the private key, you keep it to yourself. It must remain private. And the public key, you're safe to broadcast it. So if you encrypt something with the private key, anybody with the public key can verify that it was encrypted with that private key, and vice versa. If you encrypt something with a public key, only the owner of the private key can decrypt it. When you take a second to think about this, it unlocks two incredible use cases. So the first one is, imagine there is a central entity, there is somebody on the internet, and they make their public key known, and there are multiple people that want to communicate with them. So what they can do is they send a secret, or they send some data that they encrypt with the recipient's public key. They are sure that only the owner of the private key, which is the intended recipient, will receive that data. So you can basically communicate over an insecure channel by encrypting something with a public key, and only the owner of the private key can decrypt. And this is actually what happens with GPG when you send secured email or messages. Another cool variation of this is if you encrypt a secret with the recipient's public key, and they decrypt that secret using their private key. So now they have a secret. So you both now share the same secret that you can use to establish a secure channel, a continuous secure channel. And guess what? This is exactly what HTTPS does. So when you access a website and you have the nice lock in your browser, it's powered by public-private key cryptography. So that's the first use case, which is just amazing, and it's behind the security of the internet. The second use case, if you take a second to think about it, so somebody has a private key that only they own, and they can use it, and everybody else can verify that something has been encrypted with that private key. So if there is a huge piece of data, or if there is some data, and they use their private key to encrypt that data, and then anybody has the public key, you can verify whether the data has been encrypted with the private key. It's as if the owner of the private key showed that they wanted to encrypt the data, that they signed off on the data, that they signed the data. And this is exactly what a signature is. And instead of signing the whole data, we just sign a hash of the data, which is practically the same thing, but with it's a smaller size. And so signing the hash of the data with the private key is basically broadcasting to the world that you agree on this content, that you signed it, and anybody can verify the signature. And this is exactly how Bitcoin transactions are signed. So when you want to unlock funds, you take the previous outputs, reference them, and you specify the new outputs, and you sign that with your private key. And you are basically telling the network, I, the owner of the private key corresponding to this public key to which the funds were allocated, I'm transferring that to the new outputs. And you sign it. And anybody with the public key can verify it. And that's just magical. This is actually at the heart of it, what powers the security of the blockchain from a cryptographic point of view. So there are multiple flavors to asymmetric cryptography. One famous one is RSA, which relies on large prime numbers. And this is very much used in HTTPS and a lot of internet protocol. But there is another variant called ECC, which is elliptic cryptography, which is used by Bitcoin. So what is ECC? So ECC is based on an ellipsis, an elliptic or an elliptic curve, which looks something like this. Its equation is, you can see it's very well displayed here. This is basically y squared modulo p equals x cubed plus 7 modulo p. And the modulo p means that the operation, the equation is taking place in a finite numbers field, which means numbers below p. And this really doesn't, this is really done to make the math work better and to avoid floating point operations. So anyway, we'll get to that later. Elliptic cryptography defines some mathematical operations. So it defines addition as follows. So if you have 2 points in the curve and you draw a line, it must intersect with the curve at a third point. The reflection of this intersection is the result of the sum of these 2 points. So to sum 2 points, draw a line, the intersection, reflect it, you get the result. And if you define the sum, you can define the multiplication. So summing multiple times is basically multiplying. So you can imagine the sum as intersect, reflect, intersect again, reflect. You can imagine it as the point hopping around the elliptic curve. And there is one special case. So when we add the point to itself, so instead of drawing a line that intersects 2 points, we just draw the tangent. And it's the intersection of the tangent with the curve, we reflect it and we get the result of adding the point to itself. So basically, multiplying a point by itself is making it jump around the curve again. And surprisingly enough, this operation provides a great deal of security. And it goes like this. If you generate a huge number, we're talking like some 256 bits, for instance, or 128 bits. So we are talking one followed by dozens and dozens of zeros. And you multiply a fixed point, let's call it the generator point, this nice G here, with this generated number, let's say a trillion trillions. And if you jump around, you land on some random point on the curve, and there is no way to know how many times you jumped around to get here. And the resulting point, its coordinates, is the public key, and the number of hops is the private key. And there you go. This is exactly how it's done. So the private key is a number, a very big one. It's actually 256 bits. And as we said, it's a few zeros shy from the number of atoms in the universe. The public key is the result of the multiplication of the generator point, which is well established in ECC algorithms. And we land on a point, and the point has two coordinates, x and y. Each has 32 bits. So that's 32 times 2, 64 bytes. And we add a prefix, and that's how we get a 65 bytes public key. And that's all there is to it. Actually, there is a lot more, but that's all we're gonna say about it. It's very fascinating, actually. Okay, let's talk about output and input scripts. So I have kind of been misleading you. It's not actually me, it's the book. So we do not actually send data to a public key. What we do is we send data to an output script. And this output script, in most cases, maybe the majority of cases, it says verify signature based on this public key. But if it is a script that need to evaluate to true, you can have multiple conditions. You can have two public keys instead of one. You can have 2 out of 3 public keys, so you can have a contract where 3 people are participating in any 2 out of 3 can unlock the funds. You can add some time conditions. You can even add if, else. And this is exactly what the output script does. So there is a very simple scripting language that Bitcoin has. It's called script with a nice big S. And you can send the money to a script. And anybody who can satisfy that script, that output script using an input script, can spend these funds. As we said, in most cases, it's just sending money to a public key and producing a signature. But it can be many complex things. And this flexibility is really what enables smart contracts. Very cool, very impressive stuff. So there was an evolution of output scripts. So the first one was the P2PK, which is basically pay to public key, where you just had the public key in the output script, and you needed followed by an object sig, which is operation to check the signature that maps to this public key, and the spender needs to provide the signature. So this object sig takes 2 operands, which is the signature and the public key. It hashes the transaction to produce the hash, and it decrypts the signature with the public key, and it compares the 2. If they are equal, it means the owner of the private key signed it. But one cool thing about this is everybody running the Bitcoin software could have their node accessible online, and you could hit the node and it will send you a public key, and you could use that to send addresses to Bitcoins to it. This is kind of neat, but the thing is, you need to have your node online to be able to receive requests. And this is not very practical for most people to have something accessible online. So this did not last long. Then came the legacy pay to PKH, which is pay to public key hash. So we mentioned previously that the public keys are 65 bytes. As we said, 2 coordinates of the point, so 230 twice 32 bytes, plus a nice prefix to indicate that it's a public key, so that's 65 bytes. 65 bytes is a lot. So instead of sending the money to all the 65 bytes, we could hash it and make it smaller. And we know that the hash function always produces the same output for the same input. And so if we have a hash function that gives us a smaller output, and in this case, what Satoshi did is he used SHA-256, which actually produces 64 bytes, 32 bytes, and then he used another hashing function after that called, he hashed the first hash using RIP EMD 160, which produces 160 bits, which is 20 bytes. So we have a big key with initially of 64 bytes, 65 bytes. We hashed once to make it 32, then we hashed that using RIP EMD to make it 20 bytes. So, and we send the money to these 20 bytes. And this is pretty practical. So you can see the operation here, RIP EMD, apply it to SHA-256, you get the result hash. And so the output script looks like this. The commitment is actually the hash. And so, yeah, this is pretty neat actually. So it's op dupe, which is duplicate, and then op hash 160, which is this operation basically, SHA-256 followed by RIP EMD 160. And what happens here is the input that Bob will provide is his signature and his public key. And so what would happen here is we have the signature, we have the public key. The public key would be duplicated. And then one of the two public keys would be hashed. So we make sure that we are indeed spending the correct hash. So we verify the equality of the hashed public key with the original commitment, with the original hash the money is supposed to be sent to. If that is equal, then we check the signature of the public key. And there you go. This is just to allow the sender to send money to a smaller destination. Pretty cool, to be honest. And here we can see the Bitcoin script in all its glory. And imagine this is very basic. You can have a lot of complex stuff. Okay, so Bitcoin at its core deals with binary data that can be encoded in hexadecimal format. So a hexadecimal number goes from 0 to 15, so you have 16 possibility from 0 to 9 and from A to F. And there is a famous format used to encode binary data in text format, which is called base64. This is used in emails, in browsers, in lots of places. Base64 is basically lowercase letters, uppercase letters, numbers, digits, and slash and plus. So you can take any binary data, split it into groups of 3 bytes, so that's 24 bits. And these 24 bits, you split them into 4 groups of 6 bits. At 6 bits, that's 64 values. So if we have an alphabet of 64, base 64, we can map 6 bits groups to text letters, to either A or a number or slash or plus. And that's basically base 64, a way to encode binary data in text format. Bitcoin uses a very close encoding, which is base 58 check. And base 58 is 64 minus 6. So we remove 6 letters, which usually bring a lot of confusion. So you probably agree. You have 0 and O, they look very much alike. You have I and L, lowercase l, they look very much alike. And then we also remove the plus and slash. They were not very liked. Who knows? So anyway, base 58 is base 64 with these 58 characters that constitute its alphabet. And that's how Bitcoin binary addresses are encoded. And in addition to that, we add a checksum. So a checksum is simply a way to make sure we did not make any mistakes. And the way it works is you have your address and you hash it twice. So you get a unique hash that is always obtained when you input your address. and you append the beginning of the hash result to your address. So when somebody receives your address plus the checksum, they hash the address and they compare the first bytes of the hash result to the checksum. And if it matches, you probably didn't make any mistakes. And if they don't, a mistake has been made. And that's base 58 check. So you can see the checksum is obtained like this. Oh yeah, the data is also prefixed with a value to indicate whether it's a public key or private key or whatever. And here we can say it. We have the payload, we have the prefix, we hash the prefix plus the payload and take the first 4 bytes. We base encode it with 58. We basically map it to the 58 character alphabet. And voila. We can see that there are different prefixes. So depending on whether they are paying to public script hash, public key hash, or even a private key, lots of exciting stuff. Okay. Yeah, compressed public keys. So one very interesting idea is that, as we mentioned previously, public keys are 65 bytes, and they are a point in the elliptic curve. But the elliptic curve, for each x, it only has 2 potential y's. So imagine, for instance, the elliptic curve. When you get an x, it can only have 2 potential y's. So instead of encoding the whole y value, you just say which y you are using. And so you only have the x, you have a byte to say whether you are using this y or that other y, and you have it, and that's it. And instead of using 65 bytes, you use 33 bytes, which is a compressed public key, which is pretty exciting when you think about it. And it's actually y is even or is odd, because we are operating in finite prime field. So all the operations are with modulo p being a large prime number. And so the y could either be an even or an odd number. If you dig into the math, it totally makes sense. Legacy pay to hash, go to script hash. So base 58 check was all good, but it had a few problems. First of all, it contained lower and upper case letters. So when you say it out loud, you kind of sounded like a dummy. Uppercase this, lowercase that, uppercase this. Not very cool. Another issue was that its checksum mechanism only told you that there was an issue. There was no way of isolating the issue to which part of the data you made a mistake in. Finally, when represented as a QR code, given that it has a mix of lower and upper case letters, it used a large QR code encoding, which meant it produced larger QR codes. So if we had only a single case, lower or upper, we could use smaller QR codes that are easier to scan. And finally, it was not forward compatible because it did not have a version field. Well, all these shortcomings were solved by BESH 32. 32, as you might have guessed, stands for the number of letters in its alphabet. It has only one case of letters and digits. And because it has only a single case, it produces smaller QR codes. And it also has a very clever checksum mechanism that isolates the error to 4 character groups. And it had a version byte that make it forward compatible, meaning that if new address types or new variations are needed, you could specify it in the version and the software could easily tell, which is pretty cool. There was, however, a small issue with the first version of BESH 32 in its checksum algorithm that allowed having multiple Q values without breaking the checksum, redundant Q values without breaking the checksum. So it looks something like this. This was easily fixed by tweaking the algorithm, and this resulted in Pesh32M, with the M standing for modified. And all Base32 addresses start with a human readable part, which in the case of mainnet addresses, it's BC. So when you see a Bitcoin address starting with BC followed by a 1, this means this is a Base32 encoded address. And the one in the transaction I demoed in the previous video is just that. It's a Base32 1 address. So private keys are 256 bits or 32 bytes. In the code, they are mostly represented in hexadecimal or in binary, but there is a WIF format or the wallet import format, which is used for importing, exporting the private keys from wallets and scanning them as QR codes. This format is simply a prefix to indicate that this is a private key. The prefix is 128, followed by the 32 bytes of the private key. Then there is a compression flag, which we'll talk about in a minute. And there is a 4-byte checksum. So you align all these together and encode them in base 58 check, and that's your private key. So there is this notion of compression, of compressed private keys, which is kind of a misnomer because private keys cannot really be compressed like public keys. They are not actually points in the graph that can be compressed. And so when we talk about compressed private keys, we are actually talking about a private key that is used to generate a compressed public key. And if it is a private key that's used to generate an uncompressed or normal public key, it's an uncompressed private key. So that's the distinction. So there is this notion, this concept of vanity addresses, which is much like a vanity license plate. It's just a public key address that has some nice pattern. For instance, this one has love pizza or something. And the way it works is you just mass generate multiple public keys until you stumble upon a pattern that you like. And as you can imagine, this is very compute intensive and time consuming. So at some point there were pools that offer the service to run multiple computation for you and looking for a pattern that you like. And as one can imagine, there has been instances where fonts have been stolen from these vanity addresses because if somebody else generates the key for you, you really can't be 100% sure that your fonts are secure. As you can see here, for instance, these are patterns for kids charity, and it shows that the longer the pattern is, the more time is needed to search for that pattern. Finally, at the beginning, and to encourage Bitcoin adoption, there were these paper wallets which had public and private keys printed, and so people could just scan and get started. But this was later deprecated because, as you can see, if your private key is out there, it's not really that secure. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So let's talk about wallets. Physical wallets hold cash. Bitcoin wallets only hold keys that unlock funds from the blockchain. With your public key, you can look at all your transactions and check your balance, and so does anybody who has access to your public key, which is public. So all your transactions are public. With your private key, you can sign transactions to spend those funds and transfer the ownership of your Bitcoin to some other public keys. If you lose your private key, or if it's compromised, you lose your funds. That's why some wallets only keep public keys and are basically read-only wallets. And they rely on external hardware devices to store the private keys and sign transactions. So this way, your private key is never directly connected to the internet, which is way more secure. Using a single public key for all your transactions is a big no-no for your privacy. It's possible to generate a new public-private key pair for each transaction, but the downside to that is you need to back up your wallet each time you generate a private key. Otherwise, you might lose access to it and lose your funds. There is, however, another way of doing things. What if we could generate different public-private key pairs, but have the only one secret to remember? And that's what deterministic key generation is all about. So if we take some entropy, a random sequence of characters, and append values or add values to it, then hash the result. As long as we are adding values in a deterministic manner, so we start with 1, then 2, then 3, or some other predictable sequence, and then hash the result, we always get the same keys. So if we have, for instance, the same seed, and append an integer to it, and hash the result with SHA-256, we get seemingly completely random and independent keys, but there is a deterministic way to generate them, but it is only known to us. And that's what deterministic key generation is all about. If we use these new keys as new parents and generate children from them, we get a hierarchy of keys. And that's what hierarchical deterministic key generation is. And there is a Bitcoin improvement proposal that defines that in great detail. So with this deterministic way of generating keys, we can have a new key for each new transaction and completely protect our privacy, and we only have to remember a seed. And if our wallet is corrupted, we can recreate it using that single seed. Seeds are usually 128 or 256 bits, and they are mapped to a sequence of words. So if you have, for instance, 256 bits and you chop them up into 11 bits parts, so each 11-bit part could be mapped to a dictionary of 2048 words. So your seed is simply a sequence of words, which is pretty cool. And when you think about it, so imagine having all your funds that can be accessed all over the world with just a sequence of words. That's amazing when you think about it. There are multiple recovery code algorithms. So basically transforming your seed into a sequence of words. So you have BIP39, which is pretty widely used, but you also have an Electrum recovery code, a Moon recovery code, etc. So we talked about having a way to recover keys, and we talked about key data, but there is another kind of data, which is called non-key data. And it's pretty useful. So that could be the exchange rate at the time of the transaction. It could be the transaction label or a description for the transaction. And when you think about it, if you take a look at the bank statement and you only see dates and numbers, it's not very helpful. You can maybe identify the transaction at 4 in the morning, you getting fast food after an eventful night out, but it's really hard to parse just numbers and amounts. And that's why it's kind of important to have your non-key data backed up. And there are mechanisms for that in a BIP describing how you can back up the your non-key data in JSON file. It could even be encrypted using one of the keys. So a lot of interesting stuff. So BIP39, Bitcoin Improvement Proposal, is defines the way we obtain the seed from the recovery codes. BIP32 is another Bitcoin improvement proposal that outlines the derivation algorithm. So how do we actually obtain children using the parent? Like what's the hash function input exactly, and how do we use the output and all that. We also need a way to map which key was used for which transactions. Because the way BIP32 works is you can generate from each parent key 4 billion child keys, because a 32 bits index is used. So that's 4 billion. And so which one of these is used for which transaction? There are two ways of mapping a transaction to its key. So you can have explicit paths stored with the transaction in the wallet. So for instance, we can have something like that says from the master key, child number 44, then it's first child, then it's first child. That's the key that has been used for this transaction. Or you could have implicit paths, which are defined in various BIPs, which say, for instance, for this type of transaction, we usually rely on this path. So take the master key, generate child 44, then its first grandchild, then its first grandchild, and so on and so forth. So two ways of doing things. You can either rely on convention, which is defined in various BIPs, or you can actually store the actual path in the tree that identifies which key was used for that particular transaction. And the BIP that defines these paths, and we'll talk about in a second, is BIP 44. So BIP 39 defines how recovery codes for wallet are generated, but how does it actually work under the hood? So we first generate a random sequence of 128 bits or 256. We then add a checksum of these bits, so we hash them using SHA-256 and take the 4 first bytes. So when we copy this data, we can check whether we made a mistake or not. So if we get a new sequence and hash it, we compare our hash with the checksum, which was a previous hash, and if they are equal, no mistake. We didn't probably make a mistake. Otherwise, a mistake has been made. So once we have the sequence and the checksum, we split it into 11 bits, and 11 bits, so 10 bits is 1024 times 2, 248. So 11 bits is 248 possible values. And we create a dictionary of 248 words. And each 11 bits is an index in that dictionary. So each 11-bit part, you map it to a word from the dictionary, and you have a sequence of words, and there you go. That's your code. It looks something like this. So the entropy, the checksum, split into 11 bits, and map to a word in the dictionary, and you have your recovery code, which is a pretty cool trick when you think about it. So we have our recovery code. How do we go from the recovery code to an actual private key? So as I mentioned previously, we can add a passphrase to the recovery code. So it even gives another layer of entropy. And you can have different passphrases that generate completely different private keys using the same recovery code, meaning the same seed. So once we have the recovery code and the passphrase, we concatenate them together and pass them to a key stretching function. So The key stretching function is basically an algorithm that runs multiple hashes, a large number of hashes, in this case SHA-512, on the input. And this is to add more obfuscation to the seed. But also, if part of the recovery code is revealed somehow, using the key stretching function adds an extra layer of complexity because the attacker, even if they have the first half of the key, they need to run multiple hashing functions to try and brute force the key. So it adds an extra layer of security. So with the recovery code and the potential passphrase, once we apply the key stretching function, we obtain our 512-bit seed. And we can see a few examples. So from this recovery code, we can obtain this 512-bit seed. There is another one. So it's a pretty nifty way to go from words that are easy to remember by us humans to actual completely random seeds. So we have our 512-bit seed. How do we actually get our nice, beautiful tree of deterministic keys? So it works like this. The 512 bits are split into two. The left half is the actual master private key, and the right half is what they call the master chain code. And the algorithm is pretty clever. So first of all, once we have the master private key, we just multiply it by the generator point, and we obtain the master public key. So we have the master private key, master public key, and master chain code, which is the right half of the 512C. And we can see how the flow goes. So once we have these, we can simply concatenate the master public key with the master chain code and add an index, give all that to a hash function and obtain the 512 seed of a child. And if we want the second child, we just increase the index number and so on and so forth. And so for the parent key, we can generate 32 bits potential children, which are 4 billion. And the clever idea is that the new generated 512 bits is split into a left half, which is the child private key, and from there we can generate the public key by multiplying with the generator point, and the right half is the child chain code, and we can repeat the same algorithm. So the child public key with the child chain code, we add the index and we generate the grandchildren, and so on and so forth. And it's so simple and yet so elegant because you have this recovery code, you add an optional passphrase and you generate this random seed, then you split it, pass add an index to identify each child, and use a hash function to generate a completely deterministic key that looks completely random and can be used and protect your privacy, but it all derives from these recovery codes, which is pretty cool. So one very cool use case is having this master public key in the master code chain in some web store, some e-commerce website, and for each new transaction, so this is called the extended key. The parent public key and the parent child code are called an extended public key. And so you can have it in some e-commerce web server, and for each new transaction, you can generate a new public key, and there is no compromising information because the private key does not have to be stored on that web server. And so you can have a whole infinite number of public keys that you send to your customers and receive payments to, and it's all secure, and you can later use your master private key to generate the corresponding private child keys, and you can collect your payments, which is pretty cool. So there is, however, one big caveat to all of this. So if we scroll up and see how the child private key is exactly generated. So when we hash the extended public key, the parent public key and the parent chain code with the index number, and take the left part of the hash result, what we do with it is we add it to the parent private key. So from the parent private key to the child private key, there is simply the addition of this left half. So imagine a scenario where the child private key is compromised and the extended public key is compromised as well. The extended public key is not supposed to be that big of a secret because it has only the public key. So if you have the extended public key, this means you can easily generate this left side and this right side. And if you have the child private key, because it's simply an addition with the parent private key, this means the child private key minus this part give you the parent private key. So what this means is by gaining access to the child private key and having access to the extended public key, we can recover the parent master private key, which is just a huge security vulnerability. And if you have the parent private key, you can basically generate the whole tree of child private keys, which is game over. So the weak link in this vulnerability is the fact that there is direct connection between the parent public key, which is public, with the child private key. The fix for this is, instead of relying on the parent public key in the hash, what if we relied on the parent private key, which will always be private and stored in a secured cold storage location, to generate the left side and then generate the child private keys? When we use the parent private key in the hash instead of the public key, we call this a hardened key, because even if the child private key is compromised, there is no way of getting the parent private key, because you cannot generate this left side of the hash because you don't have the parent private key. So even if you have the parent public key and the child private key, there is no way of reconstructing the parent private key. And so hardened keys are way more secure, and they are generally used at the upper levels of the hierarchical tree. So at the lower levels, if you used a public key, even if it's compromised, you only compromise that part of the tree. But if you use it at an upper level, if one node is compromised, you are at a high point in the tree, and this means the whole tree is compromised. So anyway, there is a convention that states that from 0 to 2 billion, so the first half of the 32-bit 4 billion interval, that's non-hardened keys. And from 2 billion to 4 billion, those are hardened keys. So when you look at the index, you know if it's hardened or not. So each node in the HD tree can have up to 4 billion children, and the children can have 4 billion children of their own. So it can get pretty tough to navigate. And as we mentioned previously, BIP44 defined the convention to have wallets that can support multiple types of coins. So you can even have cryptocurrencies other than Bitcoin, such as Ethereum or Doge, and you can have multiple accounts per coin type. And within that, you can have differentiations, whether it's a normal receiving account or it's a change account, so to make change for transactions that need that. And it's a convention, so it's well established and recognized amongst different wallets, and it looks something like this. And the apostrophe is to indicate that the key is hardened. So as we can notice, the higher levels of the tree of the path are always hardened to ensure more security. And for instance, over here, we can see that this is the third receiving public key. Third because here too, 0, 1, 2. Receiving, because I think this field change indicates whether it's a receiving or change key. And primary account, so the first account is the primary account and 0 is Bitcoin. If we take a look at this other path, we see it starts with lowercase m, so that's a private key. And for the coin type, we have number 2, so that's not Bitcoin, that's actually Litecoin. And for the address index, we see 1, so that's 0, 1, that's the second one. And this is indeed the second private key for the Litecoin main account. Yeah, very interesting. Anyway, this is pretty much it for wallets and keys. I hope this has been informative. Thank you for watching and have a good one.